Hello and welcome to Lost Love Chronicles.
Dear listeners, before we get started, drop a quick hi in the comments and let us know where you're tuning in from. Also, if you have any suggestions for us to make the channel better, please let us know. Now let's start with the story. McPhee and Ballard had the rescue train moving well by now. The going was easier than they had expected, as they ran the two old engines up the tracks to Warsaw. The old 260 was panting in McPhee's ear as they passed 20 miles per hour on the tracks that Plow Extra 1 had kept clear for so long. McPhee was bone tired, and he was letting Ballard do most of the work as he slumped resting against the side of the cab. He was brought back to wakefulness by the sound of a strange voice on the radio. Spearfish Lake, it called. "This is Plow Extra 1. That's Ellsberg," McPhee said. "He sure is loud for him sitting in Warsaw." Bud's voice continued to pour from the radio in the cab of the 303. "We've got critical ambulance cases on board, so have the ambulances waiting. We'll be in shortly. We're about half a mile east of the 919 crossing." McPhee's hand shot out to the air valve, and in an instant, he dumped the air with all the strength he had. At the same time, he shoved the throttle out of Ballard's hand. Back in the 9608, now without radio contact, Stevens wondered for a moment what was going on, but decided that Randall must want to stop bad. He pulled all the power off the old engine, and with his hand near the reverse lever, stood by to big hole the engine if needed. With it wheels squealing, Plow Extra 2 slid to a stop. While it was still sliding, McPhee yelled into the radio, "We just passed 919. Up in the darkened cab of the Rock, Bud was startled by the unexpected response to his call, but in an instant he dumped Plow Extra 1's air and pulled his own power off as well. Slowing rapidly, Plow Extra 1 swung around a little bend. Bud leaned out the cab window to try and see around the plow. The Chessie's headlights stared back at him. With a shaking hand, Bud keyed his microphone, trying without too much success to keep his voice level. "Be damned if you didn't, Randall." Bud let the Rock creep forward to where the two plows were almost nose to nose. Bud's knees were still weak as he climbed down from the Jeep and walked ahead to the waiting switcher. Penny climbed down from the plow and struggled with him through the snow around the two snowplow blades. They climbed up into the cab of the switcher. "Hi, Bud," McPhee croaked. "Fancy meeting you here." The old man's voice was unexpectedly weak and trembling. "You all right, Randall?" Ballard asked. "I'll be okay. It's just my chest hurts a little." The old man said he collapsed to the floor. "John." Bud started to order, but Penny had already started running to get the doctor from Plow Extra 1's way car. Bud knelt down in the Chessie's bag. McPhee was still breathing, and his pulse was weak, but it was there. Maybe Bud wouldn't have to remember what little CPR he had once learned. Where in hell is that doctor? He swore, knowing that he couldn't be here yet. While the doctor was working on McPhee's inert form, the group of railroad men cleared out into the leeward side of the Chessie. "You must be Bud Ellsberg," one of them said. "I'm Gene Ballard, from the DNO. Glad to meet you." "Gene," Bud replied. "Given a choice, I can think of better circumstances, but I'm glad you got here. Is Henry still running the 9608? "Him and Bill Lee." "Lee?" "Yeah. He rode over from Lordstown on his snowmobile. Met us at Meeker. That old thing wouldn't dare crap out on him." "What happened to your switcher?" "Injector went to crap. We left it sitting on a siding at Albany River. Let me tell you, we had one hell of a trip. We had to have the passengers dig us out any number of times, and one time we had to get rescued by a front-end loader." "What happened up here?" "We keep going back and forth some way or another," Bud replied, not daring to talk about the subject that he really wanted to talk about. "We left our switcher at Warsaw. We haven't had two engines on the shuttle run at the same time since yesterday." "How are things in Warsaw?" Ballard asked, like Bud, avoiding the subjects of the near collision and of Randall McPhee. "Still burning like hell," Bud said. "The paper plant and the fertilizer plant's gone. A lot of houses are burning, and the fire's getting too close to the oil company for comfort." "Here's the doctor," a voice said. Bud bounded up the Chessie's steps to meet the doctor at the door. "Might have been a heart attack," the doctor told the group of railroad men crowded on the Chessie's cab steps. "There's no way of telling here. He'll probably be all right, but we'd better get him to the hospital as quick as we can. One of the guys we've got back in the caboose can't take much more waiting, either." "Can he ride there all right?" Bud asked. "Better than if we transferred him," the doctor said. "I'll leave one of the EMTs here and ride back in the caboose." "We'll have to use the engine," Ballard said. "Is there any problem?" "No problem." "Gene, get moving," Bud ordered. "We'll stay clear of you. Let us know when you're off the main. We'll talk later." Within seconds, Ballard was whistling the 9608 back, while Bud, John, and the doctor struggled back through the snow to Plow Extra 1. "Man," Penny said, "when I saw that light, I was opening the cab door and getting ready to jump. I didn't think you'd get her stopped in time." "Yeah," Bud said, the reality of the situation now coming to him. "I'm just glad I got on the radio when I did." How could I have been so damn stupid to not radio in from Hoselton? I thought about reminding you, John said, but by the time I thought about it, we were already down in the hole. God, I hope Randall makes it. Me, too, Bud agreed. He's a tough old bird. John began to climb the ladder to the plow's cab. I'm going to take it real easy, Bud told him. Keep an eye out for them. If we get close, let me know. Once Bud was by himself in the cab of the rock, he let the shakes get to him for a moment. The feel of the Jeep's familiar throttle now seemed almost like touching a snake. He powered up Plow Extra 1 only by a conscious effort of will. A mile or more ahead of Plow Extra 1, Ballard was pushing the other train for the hospital as hard as he could. As the little train rumbled backward through the night, he heard Ellsberg's voice on the radio. Betty, is the ambulance there yet? Both of them just pulled up, she replied. We're going to have another passenger for them. Randall just collapsed with chest pains. His voice grew very hard as he said, we didn't hit, but just by sheer luck. Right, she replied flatly. We had a call from Walt right after you called. There was a mix-up. We'd understood from the fire hall in Warsaw that you were still there. Walt caught the error and called us, but by then we heard you two talking. 15 minutes later, Plow Extra 2 was parked on track 2 of the Spearfish Lake yard. Plow Extra 1 pulled straight in beside it. McPhee had already been loaded into the ambulance. Bud stopped, cut off the way car, and pulled ahead to the engine shed while the ambulances went to get Joe McGinnis and the other injured firemen. In a few minutes, the ambulances were off, following a city snowplow in a blaze of lights, carrying the injured off to the hospital. By that time, Bud had the rock inside the engine shed and was ridding himself of the shakes with thoughts of the good, stiff drink he would have when he didn't have to run an engine somewhere. Ed was smart enough to avoid the obvious subjects. Still shorted? He asked. Yeah, Bud said. Not as bad as the Burlington that last trip, but bad. Well, that's that, the mechanic said. We're going to have to cool it with this engine until we can get it dried out good. I've been going through the Burlington's motors, trying to figure out how much damage we caused. And be glad the diesel crapped out. If it hadn't, you would have had a hell of a repair bill. Bud shook his head. Well, at least now we can let this thing sit for a while. The chassis and the 9608 don't add up to the power of the rock, but they can still get up to Warsaw and protect the scram train. How long do you think we've got to let the rock sit? 6 hours minimum, inside where the wind and blowing snow can't get at it. I know you were going to put tarps down over the sides, but they must not have helped. After 6 hours, we can have a look at the amperage and make up our minds. Familiar problems were starting to get Bud settled down. It was just as well, for the door opened, and Henry Stevens, Gene Ballard, Bill Lee, and John Penny walked in. Bud was especially happy to see Lee. The two had much in common, for both of them had similar problems from being short-line railroaders, and they were hardly strangers, anyway. I never thought I'd be as happy to see you and your old Baldwin, he told Lee. That now represents maybe half of the working power we've got left. I'm just glad we could make it, Lee said. That was a hell of a trip you sent us on. I know. Gene here told me. I heard him. You didn't see me in the dark. He didn't tell you enough. You don't know how many times I wished we had that big plow of yours down there. It could have punched through a lot of the drifts that stopped us. You made it, Bud replied. That's what's important. I guess I'd better get you people on up to Warsaw. This thing is down for at least 6 hours, he said, nodding to the rock, and I don't want to leave the Milwaukee alone for that long. The oil company could go at any time. Now Ed spoke up. Before they go, Bud, there's something I'd like them to do. What's that? I'd like them to go get the 1478 and haul it up here. I've been thinking about what Bill told me, and I've been looking at the Burlington. There's a chance I can get one of them going with parts from the other. Lee shook his head. That means injector pump parts, Ed. I could be wrong, but isn't that a factory repair? Well, yeah, it is, normally, Sloat replied, but when I was in the engine room of the Hardhead, we had one crap out on us while we were on simulated war patrol. We rebuilt it, and it lasted out the trip. How long did it take? Bud asked the retired submariner. 2 or 3 days, but we had to build a lot of the parts, Sloat replied. I don't think the Burlington's pump is as bad off, and there's a good chance we're looking at mix and match. It's worth a try, I guess, Bud said. But, fix the 1478. I don't want to trust the Burlington anymore. Ballard shook his head. Those people on our consist have been screwing around on that train for a hell of a long time, and they're starting to get a bit pissed off at the speed we're not making. We could do both, Bud said. We can send the people up there with Bill's engine, and that would take care of the scram train, too. Lee made noises indicating extreme doubt. I don't know that you want to risk that, Bud. That thing is held together like I never would have believed, considering what we've put her through. I'm proud of the way she's taken it. But, let's face it, she's too old and senile to be let out by herself on a night like this. Stevens, who was shaken with worry about his old friend, agreed. What's more, he went on, I haven't been on the 303 since the trip started, but I'll tell you this. It's awful fragile for what we've been giving it. If we send the two out together, there's a good chance that one will stick together long enough to get us somewhere. But we don't want to let either of them out alone. Bud nodded. He knew Stevens well enough to know that he didn't talk much, but when he said something, it was worth listening to. We could still try for Warsaw, Ballard said. That's what we were doing when we met you. Tell you what, Bud replied. Let's call Warsaw. If they've got a lot of danger of the fire getting to the propane tank, let's get you guys the hell up there. If they're holding their ground, let's send the passengers over to Rick's and make a quick trip to Albany River. Unlike their pullback from the Jerusalem paper plant earlier in the day, the collections of fire departments in Warsaw gave up their positions on Plain Street only after the most stubborn resistance. Things seemed to be looking up for Fred Linder, for the wind was getting around even further to the north, making the possibility of the fire jumping across the alley to the buildings fronting Main Street ever more unlikely. If the wind would just settle down and blow out of the north for a while, he'd have the worst of the fire in Warsaw under control. If the fire jumped Main Street before the wind began to blow out of the north, he'd really have his hands full, since there was nothing to stop houses right across the street from the oil company from burning. If he could hold Main Street, then the fire could only blow onto the already burning fertilizer plant, and the fire that was there wasn't going anywhere, even if the building melted through. But that was far off in the future. Holding the line where they were wasn't going to be any picnic. Since dark, Linder had slowly been pulling units off of the fires on Plain Street as their cause became hopeless, and moving them to their new locations. He had seen no sleep for coming up on 2 days, now, and for the moment, things seemed under control. Once Spearfish Lake had been moved to their new location, Linder rode his snowmobile over and told Masterfield, "You're in charge for a while. I'm going over to the rest train for a bit. If things get out of hand, or if the fire jumps to the west side of Main Street, give me a call." "When do you want those units still in Plain Street to move to their new locations?" the Spearfish Lake chief asked. "Albany River can move when they've got what they're working on knocked down, or if the danger on 2nd Street gets out of hand. Walsenburg can move whenever it gets too hot for them. You and your chiefs be the judge. Whatever happens, give me a call at midnight, and we'll see what's happening then." "Will do," Masterfield said. "Get what rest you can. If you people aren't too heavily engaged when I get back," Linder replied, "why don't you figure on taking a break then?" The Spearfish Lake chief was grateful for the offer. He had no idea how long it had been since he had last had a rest. However bad he felt, he was sure that Fred Linder had it worse. The Warsaw fire chief rode his snowmobile past the charred heap of rubbish that had been the Jerusalem paper main plant. Somewhere in his tired mind, he knew that he wouldn't be going back to work there when the fire was over and he'd had a chance to rest up. Since the fire had started, he hadn't had a chance to think further ahead than that. There probably wasn't much hope of staying in Warsaw after the fire was out, and he felt vaguely that he was presiding over the death of the town, whether it burned to the ground or not. When the fire was out, there'd be time enough to figure out what to do next. He stumbled into the dining bus and plopped down next to Walt Archer. Archer was worried, and even in his tired state, Linder could tell without asking. "Any word from Spearfish Lake?" the engineer asked. "Not a thing that I've heard," Linder replied. "If it hasn't been on Plain Street, then I probably haven't heard about it." "Did the plow train have troubles?" "I don't know," Walt agonized. "We had a call up here a little while ago, and somehow the call got to some idiot from Kremlin. They asked if the train was still here. He thought this was the train that they meant, so he said it was. Bud left a long time ago, but they wanted him to stay here. That could only mean the train from Camden was upbound. I had your people send a message down to Spearfish Lake to stop them, but I haven't heard anything since. Jesus, I hope the message got through, and it's just that nobody thought to tell me. We don't need a cornfield meat on top of everything else." "Cornfield meat?" I head on. "You're right," Linder replied, stunned. "That would mean the end of any more help from Spearfish Lake. We don't need that, too. Tell you what, I'll call the fire hall and have them call down and find out." "I'd appreciate that," Walt said. Linder picked up his portable radio and opened a bus window far enough to stick the antenna outside. Rumsey, over at the fire hall, responded quickly to his call. "We've got a call coming through from them right now. Stand by." Walt looked tense. Even Linder was alert. "Message from Bud Ellsberg." The radio squawked after a couple of eons. "He wants to know, do you need him back up here real bad right away, or does he have some time for some engine repairs?" A wave of relief flooded over both the engineer and the fire chief. There'd been no mention of a wreck, and if Ellsberg had the capability to come right back to Warsaw, then there couldn't have been one. The line was still open. Linder turned to Archer. "He must have gotten through all right. What do you think about the engine repairs?" "If he wants the time, he probably needs it," Walt said, "but not so bad that he can't give you the choice." That was no help. In the long run, keeping that one engine going was of extreme importance to Fred Linder, and maintaining it might well be important to having it say, tomorrow. Tell him to work on it, but make it as quick as he can, Linder said into the radio. The fire chief sat down next to the engineer, at the plate of stew and the cup of coffee he'd brought in. As tired as the fire chief was, the thought of food didn't appeal to him, and the coffee wouldn't do much for his tired nerves. Piss on it, he said. I'm going back to one of the buses and get some sleep. I'm told the sleeping is kind of bad back there, Archer replied. You need it more than most. There's a cot in the cab of the engine, and it's quiet in there. If you leave your radio here, I'll come and wake you up if they need you. That's nice of you. Don't let me sleep past midnight, and call me if there's trouble. The gentle idle of the Milwaukee's diesel drowned out a lot of the noise in the area, but Linder didn't exactly need lulling to sleep. He'd barely hit the cot when he was out like a light. All right, Bud told the railroad men in the engine shed. We'll go for the 1478. Somebody go send the passengers to Rick's, and the rest of us will turn to on getting heat on the rock. Once we've got that done, we'll take the other two engines to Albany River. Stevens got Bud's attention. If it's not going to be too much trouble, he said, we ought to back the 9608 down there. Why's that, Henry? Bud asked. Well, if we head down there, that puts the back of the cab to the wind. Then, when we come back up here, that's going to be mighty uncomfortable. Good point. It won't be any more trouble, either, Bud said, and went on, I suppose, to be on the safe side, we ought to take a plow. It'll about have to be the little plow, Penny said, unless you want to get the rock out to get at the big one. The little one ought to be enough, Bud said. It's only been a couple hours since these guys came over that track. You coming with us, Bud? The D&O man asked. Might as well, he replied. The alternative is to sit around here while the rock dries out, and I don't want to sit around here right now. Privately, most of the men in the building would have agreed that sitting around would give them too much time to think about McPhee and about the near collision. As a result, in a few minutes, Ellsberg, Penny, Ballard, Stevens, and Lee were heading down the line to Albany River with Plow Extra 2's remaining engines. After all the desperate trips to Warsaw that Bud had been making, it seemed as if it had been years since he had been down the tracks to Albany River, and it took a lot of thinking to realize that his last run up these tracks had yet to be a full 3 days before. The trip to Albany River wasn't long. It was only a half hour or so before they were pulling up to the siding at the Albany River Coal and Lumber Company. Something about the location reminded Bud that he still had to put together a quotation on a freight contract with the company. Betty had said something about it. When? The day before yesterday. That was all. Freight contracts to places like the Lumber Company were going to have to be more important in the future, since there wouldn't be the Jerusalem paper traffic. Bud knew that sometime soon he would have to think about such things. When the fire was out, maybe then he and Matson and a few other people could take time for the problem. The railroad had been keeping Warsaw alive. Once the fire was out, then the Camden and Spearfish Lake could worry. They stopped next to the red and white switcher, and Bud went out to uncouple the 9608. Stevens backed the steamer up past the switch points, then ran the engine up, coupled onto the 1478, and dragged it out onto the main line. Ballard backed up the chassis and coupled it onto the front of the switcher, then whistled to consist forward. Doesn't the radio in the steamer work? Bud asked. Nah, it crapped out the last time we were up here, the D&O man said, whistling for a crossing. Battery's dead, I think. We get back, I'll have Ed take a look at it, Bud replied. As they were coming into Spearfish Lake, Ballard asked, Bud, where do you want to park this thing? Let's just shove it in the engine shed, Bud replied. There ought to be enough room in there for it, and we can move it with the rock when we get ready. I don't want to keep you guys around here any longer than I can help it. We've left the scram train by itself long enough. Take our way car, since it's set up as an ambulance. You might have to make an ambulance run back this way. Ballard nodded. How do you want to handle train orders? I don't think we want to risk a meet like that last one again. Right, Bud agreed, the subject finally out in the open. Even if we get the rock going right away, I'll sit here until you or Walt calls the office on the telephone. Then, you sit there. Don't come back this way without calling the office yourself on the telephone and getting clearance. I don't want any more of this jazz of messages being passed third hand through the fire hall. The only message we'll have for you through them is to call the office. The scram train can go to Hoselton anytime, so don't go past Hoselton without calling them on the radio and finding out where they are. That'll work, Ballard agreed. Sorry to look so amateurish, Bud said, embarrassed. But I guess that's what we get for only having one train going at a time, most of the time. We're not used to that kind of thing, and what with losing the plant, it doesn't look like we'll ever have to get used to it. Sitting at the office platform, the final loading of Plow Extra 2 was underway. Betty came out and waved at Bud. He and Jean went over to see what had happened. We just heard from the hospital, she said. Randall is doing all right. They think he was just more tired out than anything, and it got to him. They don't think he had a heart attack or anything like that. Now, there's a relief, Bud said, his heart a lot lighter. I think I'm going to be able to put up with the bitching out he'll give me. Don't worry about it, Ballard replied. As far as I could see, you had the right of way, and our orders were kind of fuzzy. That's not what bothers me, Bud told the DNO man. I should have had the system set up so it wouldn't have happened in the first place. Ballard couldn't see Bud's executive viewpoint. You may be right, he told the CNSL president, but Randall won't think about it. We'd best get a move on. A minute or so later, Bud watched Plow Extra 2 leave for Warsaw again. With just the chassis and the 9608, it didn't look like much, but it was all the help that Walt would need. As the little train vanished into the dark and the snow, Bud went into the office. I've got some of those figures you want to put together, Betty said. Do you want to study them? No, Bud said, shaking his head. I really don't have the inclination right now. If they're as bad as I think they are, it'll take whatever energy I've got left for this operation out of me. He changed the subject. I didn't see any fire departments waiting around. Not that Plow Extra 2 could have taken any more, anyway. No, she said. We've been hearing about White River for hours, but they haven't made it yet. They got sidetracked by a fire at Lynchburg back before dark, so there's no telling when they'll get here. Big fire? Not according to Upton. Just a house fire, and no real chance of it spreading. But, even if they have it out by now, they won't be here for hours, yet. We've also had word that cold water is on the way, but there's been no sign of them, yet. Guess up in Warsaw, they're going to have to make do with what Plow Extra 2 already has. With the little plow and the 303 again leading, Plow Extra 2 was out near the County Road 919 crossing again. Ballard was still running the 304, but a relief man was in the cab with him. Suddenly, the little engine lurched. Now, that's strange, Ballard commented as the speed of the train began to fall. What's strange? This son of a bitch isn't working right. In fact, it isn't working at all. You know more about it than I do. After a moment, Ballard said, the engine's winding up like it isn't attached to anything. Could be the generator field has gone out, or it could be the drive shaft to the generator, or something. At least, we're not getting amps. He reached for the whistle cord. Sloat had been unable to fix the 9608's radio. The little train eased to a stop. I suppose I'd better have them take a look at it. He only gave the engine a quick glance. There's not a lot I can do to it here. I don't know much about these little doodlebugs, anyway. Shit, Ballard replied. That's twice I've had an engine die under me this trip. Walt climbed the cab steps to the Milwaukee. Fred Linder was sleeping soundly, and it wasn't easy for Walt to wake him. Is it midnight already? The fire chief asked, still sleepy. Not quite, the engineer said. But there's trouble. They had another propane tank explode. No one hurt, but there's 2 houses on Main Street on fire. Ron Crane was sitting in the Coldwater fire station when the call came in about the train wreck. It was very quiet around the station. The department had left for Spearfish Lake and Warsaw hours before, and the Rochester department had agreed to send a tanker and a pumper to Coldwater to back them up, in case of emergency. But it had turned out that Rochester's detachment wouldn't be able to get to Coldwater until after the plows were done with convoying the Coldwater department northward, and they could be handed off to a Spearfish Lake County plow. That left the town with no fire department for a few hours, but Crane wasn't as worried about that as he once would have been. Once upon a time, Crane had been the Coldwater assistant fire chief. A couple more years, maybe 3 or 4, when Charlie Pascal retired, he would have been chief, but that was before the muscular dystrophy stranded him in his wheelchair. Nowadays, Crane mostly worked the fire station base radio when the department was out on a fire, and did some of the paperwork, and tried to keep himself occupied and useful. He still held an EMT card, and made occasional medical emergency runs if no one else was around, and he had first aiders available, and he always had them now. About a year and a half before, Coldwater and every other department for 50 miles were out fighting a wild forest fire in Tinder-Dry Woods, and Crane had been left at the station, as always, when he got a call to a garage fire on the north side of town. Crane always claimed that he had never thought out in advance what he would do in a situation like that, but it only took him the distance from the telephone to the radio microphone, not far, to figure it out. The call went out to the monitors in every volunteer fireman's home. Fire bells. Respond to the station for a structure fire. The department owned an antique pumper, old enough to be a Studebaker chassis with a Hardy pump, that was usually only kept for show, and the occasional inter-department waterball meet. The fire bells were the Coldwater Fire Department's ladies' auxiliary, usually holding bake sales or feather parties, raising money for good causes. But the fire bells were also the regional waterball champions, and Crane, who could go a short distance on crutches, had gotten the old pumper running by the time the women responded. Though the ladies weren't skilled enough to do any more than surround and drown, and only had odds and ends of turnout gear left by the men and grabbed in the rush, the old pumper could still hook to a hydrant and pump water, with Crane yelling instructions through a bullhorn. They hadn't been able to save the garage, but they had been able to keep the fire from spreading to the attached house and to the neighbors. No small feat, as dry as everything was. The fire was out, and the pumper was back at the station before a pumper arrived from Atlanta, the nearest available department. It had been a turning point for the Coldwater Fire Bells. 3 of the women who had fought the fire that day now held firefighter I certificates and had left for Spearfish Lake with the rest of the department. Several others were working on firefighter certificates, and most now had advanced first aid cards, or were EMTs. The Fire Bells hadn't held a bake sale in over a year. The old Studebaker truck sat in the station with Crane this snowy day, just in case, but now, it was not as big a thing as it once would have been to hear his words over the common fire frequency. Fire bells with snowmobiles. Report to the station for a medical emergency. A few minutes later, Brent Page heard the snowmobiles coming up the road and stopping at the crossing. He thanked the old woman that had given him shelter and went out to meet them. "You the ambulance people?" he asked. "Yeah," Crane replied from the back of his snowmobile. "You must be the guy from the railroad. You ready to go?" With Page on the back of his snowmobile to show the way, Crane led the little convoy of rescuers up the tracks to where the Lordstown Northern Alco lay stranded with the injured Darla Lee. The going northbound for Crane and the Coldwater Fire Bells wasn't a bit easier than it had been for Barton Slager and Hoddle, farther north a couple of hours earlier. The wind was against them, and it blew snow madly across the tracks. It was well after dark by now, and the headlights on the snowmobiles didn't show through the storm as well as might have been hoped. Only the traces of Page's footprints and the faint marks of where the track had been plowed out earlier were left to guide the party in many places. At least they had enough people, experienced snowmobilers, all, to be able to change off on point every few minutes. Once the lead snowmobile had cut a path, the ones following only had to worry about following the tail light of the one ahead. They made no great speed, but crawled steadily northward. It took the rescue party most of an hour to get to the stranded Alco. By now, snow had drifted up along the sides, and in another few hours it would be hard to find. One by one, the Fire Bells brought their snow machines to a stop in the lee of the engine. Brent hadn't thoroughly warmed up after his walk south, and the bitter wind of the northbound ride had taken a lot out of him. Nevertheless, he was the first one off of a snowmobile, and he stiffly ran the best he could up to the cab door of the Alco. He opened the door and spoke softly. "Darla, you made it back." He smiled. "I said I'd come back for you. I was worried about you," she said, still staring at the roof of the cab. "I thought I heard snowmobiles a while ago, and I knew it was you then, but it wasn't. I guess I was hoping too much. We're here, now," he told her. "I'd better get out of the way and let these people work on you." On crutches, and with a little help from the ladies, Crane made his way into the cramped cab of the Alco. There wasn't a lot of room for him and his helpers to work, but within a few minutes they had come to the same conclusions that Brent had reached earlier, about the broken ribs and leg, and about the possible damage to her back. Half a dozen hands, working the best they could in the crowded limits of the Alco's cab, rolled Darla slightly to the side so that a plywood backboard could be slid under her. It was easy to see that it was going to be a tough move to get her out of the cab, so they tied her firmly to the backboard, then picked it up and carried it head upright out onto the rear platform of the engine. There, it was fairly easy to put her and the backboard back into her sleeping bag. They threw even more blankets over her, then carefully picked her up and loaded her onto a well-padded sled, tying her down there. "This is going to be a long, hard ride," Crane told her, "but it's the best we can do out here. We're going to take it real easy, and we'll stop fairly often to give you a rest." "Let's get it over with," she replied weakly. "I'm so rested I could scream." Crane turned to the Fire Bells and said, "She's got to have a soft ride. We'll tow her behind my machine. If about 3 of you go ahead and beat out a trail, that'll make it a lot easier. Then, I think we should have one following, in case of trouble. Paige, why don't you ride with Mindy there?" Crane wasn't joking about going slow, Paige found out. As he rode along behind one of the Fire Bells, he knew that he had been able to go faster when he walked out. It was Crane that had the hard job, trying to run the machine smoothly and not allow the sled to have any hard bumps. At least the going was easier southbound, for the wind was now more or less behind them. Again, it still cut across ahead of them, making the visibility poor, but at least their faces were out of the wind, and the tracks from their earlier passage were still in place, giving them the chance to find their way without too much trouble. Even so, they stopped every few minutes. After the first stop, when they found that Darla's face was starting to collect snow, they covered even that, and stopped even more often to make sure the snow stayed cleared away. It seemed to Paige that the trip must have taken most of the night. In fact, it took them not much more than an hour from when they set out from the Alco until the lights of a city snowplow and an ambulance crawled into view at a forest road crossing. The backboard was untied from the sled. "How was the ride?" one of the Fire Bells asked as they worked at the frozen ropes. It was better than just laying around waiting for you, she replied. Still tied to the backboard, Darla was lifted up and placed in the ambulance. The now thoroughly chilled Brent got in behind her, and the snowplow began to lead the slow trip to the Coldwater Hospital. Brent leaned over and said to her, "How are you feeling?" "I'll make out," she replied, staring at the roof of the ambulance, her head straining against the cervical collar that Crane had put on her neck back at the Alco. She wanted to face him. "I was so worried that you wouldn't make it back for me. I was beginning to wonder a little myself." "Brent, when I met you, I thought you were kind of a jerk," she said weakly. "You're not. You saved me, and you saved the Alco, and that engine is more of my life than you might think. Maybe too much. I've got to thank you for saving both of us. Lean over here." "What?" "Lean over here," she said, more firmly now. "I can't kiss you, all tied down like this, so you'll have to kiss me." Ambulance attendants or not, Brent Page did as he was told. Much to his amazement, it turned into a long, heartfelt, soulful deep kiss that lingered on, their tongues entwining, each tasting to the other like water after a long drought. Finally, he pulled back. "Actually," she whispered, "I had something a little more personal in mind, but that can wait for later." He was silent for a moment, thinking about it. A long time later, he finally said, "I think, right now, we need to be friends more than we need to be lovers." "You've got a deal," she said. Back in the way car, the ceaseless poker game was going strong as the car rocked from side to side. Chiller could guess that it was going on, but he didn't know for sure, since he was next to Anson in the cab of the 3217. SX 3217 was on the move again. With the wind coming out of the northeast, there had been a considerable amount of drifting across the tracks from Rochester to Coldwater since the train had last passed this way many hours before. Now, the rotary made short work of the relatively small drifts. It picked the snow up off the tracks and threw it brutally off into the wind, but the wind carried much of the snow back to the train, which soon had its north side plastered in snow dust. Still, SX 3217 made better time over the tracks to the east than it had made in the morning hours, since the track had been at least partially cleared. It still seemed a slow crawl to Chiller, though much better than just sitting at Rochester. He burned with the desire to get to Warsaw. And, if the plow would keep going, even with the slower rate of advance that could be expected in the unbroken snow past Whiteport, it seemed reasonable that they ought to make the town by morning. The last word that Chiller had was that they were needed up there more than ever. He had talked to Marks about 2 in the afternoon, and had learned that Ellsberg was having a lot of engine trouble, and that he was giving up the support shuttle in order to be able to evacuate the town, since the fire was more dangerous than ever. The knowledge of Ellsberg's desperate need for SX 3217's power only deepened Steve Chiller's frustration at the lackluster progress made so far. "That son of a bitch breaks down again," he told Anson. "I'm going to make the section gang shovel the rest of the way up there." "That's a lot of digging," Anson smiled absently. "That's not what's got me worried, though. That plow moves snow all right when it's running," the engineer went on, "but I keep wondering, how will it do in brush?" "Yeah, between the brush and the bum track up there, that is something to think about," the road foreman agreed thoughtfully. "How far from Whiteport do you think we are?" "Ought to be getting there any time now," Anson said. "It's kind of hard to tell in this stuff." The blowing snow from the storm and the rotary made visibility almost nil. If it hadn't been for the fact that the 3217 could follow the rails without help from the engineer, they would never have gotten outside of Rochester. About all that Anson could do was to vary speed in response to Pickering's orders. There weren't many orders from the plow, since Pickering had stabilized the speed of the train at about 10 miles per hour, and had varied the speed of the plow to match snow conditions. Chiller chafed at the slow progress, but with the poor visibility, there wasn't much that he could do about it. SX 3217 hardly slowed as it passed through Whiteport, and a few minutes later the train was around onto northbound tracks. The snow plume that the rotary threw was now going off to the west, being carried away from the train. Anson spoke up. "You know, Steve, we really ought to stop for a minute and find out how the 3259 is running. They must have really gotten plastered back there." Chiller nodded and radioed back to the way car for Barton Slager and Hoddle to check out the engine, while they made a brief stop. A minute or two later, Hoddle called over the 3259's radio. "Can we stretch this out for a bit longer? The air filters really got packed." "Guess we'd better," the road foreman replied. "We don't want this thing dropping out on us." He took the opportunity to go back to the way car and warm up the coffee in his thermos. Sure enough, the poker game was still going on. Detar was winning again, after losing money for hours. "Better get even quickly," Chiller told him. "If the plow keeps running, we're going to be up on that Kremlin branch before long. And then we're going to have to put these section gang guys you're robbing to work." "I'm trying," the conductor replied. "God knows I'm trying." Chiller walked on past several old boxcars that had been added at Rochester. Adding them had been Bigelow's idea, to spread out the weight on the bad track ahead. At the end of the train, Hoddle and Bartonslager were still working on the 3259. I really don't know how this son of a bitch kept running, the mechanic told him. Is it going to keep running? It should now, Hoddle said. I wouldn't have wanted to be on it if we hadn't stopped. Once the train was once again on the move, it didn't take long to get to where the plow had broken down the morning before. The snow here was deep and hard-packed, and Pickering called for a speed reduction almost immediately. Within a minute, he called for another one, so that the plow could keep up with the snow. SX 3217 slowed to a near crawl, as the rotary chewed at the snow and blasted it off downwind. The progress now was very slow, which chafed Chiller even more. Still, the train was moving, and at a speed that was faster than a brisk walk. It took them nearly 2 hours to get to the little hamlet of Hugo, on the western shore of the lake, and there were still several miles to go to get to Crueling, where the real work would begin. There wasn't much that Steve Chiller could do as the train crawled north, except to sit in the cab of the leading Jeep, drink coffee, worry about the plow and whether it would keep running, and be unnecessarily curt to Anson. Presently, SX 3217 crawled out onto a long grade through the swamps northeast of the lake, and here Pickering was able to call for a speed increase. Now that's better, Chiller told the long-suffering engineer. Yeah, Anson replied. We might be able to keep this up for a while, but we get off this grade before we get to Kremling, and we'll have to slow down again. Chiller was wishing profoundly that the trouble was over. With the history the rotary had, it was rather a distant hope that it could keep running all the way to Warsaw. As the minutes crept on like hours, the plow kept roaring away with never a hint of problems, shattering the blackness of the storm-ridden night with a glare that the 3217's headlight reflected off of the plow's snow plume. The plow was still running at Kremling. Now, all we've got to do is to find the goddamn switch, Anson told the road foreman. I thought you knew where it was. I know where it is, Anson replied. I just ain't too sure where I am. Usually D&O trains ran right past the switch up to the aggregate quarry at Big Pit. No Decatur and Overland train had even tried to find the switch for the longest-used branch in years. In the end, they had to dig for the switch, much as Randall McPhee had done a few hours earlier and many miles to the west. Here, Chiller was able to rouse the section gang out and send them with shovels to find the switch mechanism. Naturally, the switch stand proved to be hidden under several feet of snow, and this weathered and hard-packed snow was tough shoveling. While the section gang worked away at the buried switch, Chiller started to get the rest of his people set up for the risky push down the branch. Jim, he told Bartonslager, I want you to be riding the 3259, just in case. We're going to take it real slow, and I want you ready to make a quick pull backwards if the track begins to settle on us. Maybe we can get out on a quick one. We're waiting a while might allow the head end to settle too much. I'm not looking forward to this, Bartonslager said. Me either, Chiller went on. Don't back down unless we tell you to. We may have to stop almost any time to cut trees or something. I really don't know what to expect. I've heard that the track is in pretty bad shape. That's what I heard, too. I don't know how bad a shape. Chiller yawned. He'd been going a long time. Guess I'll see how the section gang is doing on the switch. Oh, Tom, he said to the conductor. Keep a brakeman right near the uncoupling lever behind the way car. If the 3217 tries to go over the side, he might be able to get the train busted in time to keep the 3259 from going over the side, too. He'll have to be the judge. While Bartonslager departed for the 3259, Chiller walked back to the head end of the train. The section gang had reached the switch, but it wasn't dug out enough to change, yet. He found Pickering talking to Anson in the 3217's cab. We'll just have to go real slow and take this thing as it comes, Chiller told the two. I don't want to do anything real risky if we can help it. After all, this isn't our track anymore. Dean, I want you to sing out right away if anything feels funny, and Harry, I want you to be ready to dump power at the first peep from Dean. Chiller had barely finished speaking when the section gang came trooping back to the train from the switch. Don't get too involved in the poker game, the road foreman yelled to them as they passed the cab. This next stretch is why we brought you guys. We may need you in a hurry. One of you guys, grab a chainsaw and ride up here in the engine. Soon, they were ready. Up in the lead Jeep, Anson turned to his boss and said, Steve, do you really want to do this? Nothing better to do in a town like this. And besides, the bars will be closing soon, the road foreman replied. Get her moving. Anson eased the throttle out, and SX 3217 gingerly clicked over the switch and onto the branch, where train wheels hadn't been in years. The snow, of course, was fully as bad as it had been to the south, but the tracks proved more stable than Chiller had feared. The snow and ice they were buried in helped to hold them in place, and the rotary plow didn't put the stress on them that a blade plow would have. As advertised, brush was growing all over the place, and there were places where Pickering couldn't see through it to pick out where the tracks lay. For the first couple miles, SX 3217 was lucky with the brush, for it hadn't grown so much that the plow couldn't ride over it. Where it couldn't ride the brush and young trees down, the plow ate them up, tearing up the wood and chewing it up with screaming clunks that scared the mechanic, making him think that each revolution of the plow's blade had to be its last. The agony of the plow could be heard in the cab of the 3217. If Chiller had worried about the plow's lasting before, he had all the reason in the world to worry more now, as the train passed slowly down the tracks with tree branches brushing each side of the Jeep's cab. After the first 3 miles, the train moved out onto another grade through a swamp. Here the snow wasn't as bad, and the brush was smaller, but Anson kept the speed down. The track used to be real bad right around through here, he told Chiller. That's fine, the road foreman replied. Just take it easy, and we'll take it as it comes. The track was fully as bad as Anson had predicted. The cab of the 3217 rolled alarmingly from side to side, and the engine pitched up and down as it pushed the rotary slowly through the night. This section had never been ballasted too well, and it hadn't received any track maintenance efforts for a decade, or perhaps 2. Chiller made the whole trip along this grade while trying to hold his breath, radio microphone in his sweaty palm. If SX 3217 got very far off the tracks here, there'd be an engine and plow, at least, and maybe the whole train lost deep in the swamp. Back in the way car, even the poker game came to a stop. Section main and off-duty trainmen stayed near the doors of the way cars, ready to bail out into the snowstorm if the train showed signs of trying to run down the bank. They were worried just as much as Chiller, as the way cars rolled alarmingly from side to side each time SX 3217 went over a soft spot in the track. In the middle of the swamp, the train crept over a creaking old bridge, which amazingly stayed together. I hope they get that bridge fixed, Anson mumbled under his breath. Not likely, the road foreman replied. I doubt if the Camden and Spearfish Lake has enough money to rebuild it. And even if they didn't, why would they want to run anything over it? Not that bridge, Anson said. I meant the drawbridge down at Camden. I don't want to have to come back this way. Finally, they came to the end of the long, miserable grade. We'd never have made that in the summer, the engineer said while the rotary was slowly chewing through a deep snow and brush-filled cut at the end of the grade. The section man in the cab agreed. The ground must be frozen enough to hold what's left of the ties in place. What's next? Chiller asked. Anson strained to remember. It had been well over 10 years since he had been over the track. Seems to me that the next couple of miles is a little better. Kind of gravely ground in there, and fairly well drained. The track was fairly decent when I went over it the last time. At least, it was better than elsewhere. God knows what it's like now. The track proved stable enough to allow them to run a little faster, if the snow would have allowed them to. Here, though, they found themselves running even slower through a series of cuts, and there were several times that the rotary had to tunnel through the drifts, blasting a notch out of the top of them with the snow plume, much as they had done that morning in the cuts at Rochester. Right about now, I'm glad we've got that thing, Chiller remarked to no one in particular, even though we've had all the trouble we've had with it. Anson agreed. Can you imagine burying the blade plow in that stuff and trying to pull it out again on this track? Thanks, I'd rather not. My ulcer has been working overtime as it is. After a few more miles, the train moved out onto another rotted grade. It was much like the one that had gone before. The rusted track was no better here. It may have been worse, for all that Chiller could tell, and he wasn't about to stop and inspect it. Still, they were better than halfway up the old branch, and there had been no need for Barton Slager and the 3259 or the section gang. This was a long grade, and the slow crawl of the train kept everyone on edge just as much as the road foreman. Here, at least, there was no creaking old trestle. Instead, there were several places where the tracks dipped alarmingly. In some places, the dips had to be where there had been a washout under the ties at some point in the past, and the little gullies under the tracks were bridged only by the rails and ties, and by the snow and ice that filled them. A couple other dips had to have been places where an old culvert had collapsed a bit. Always, there was severe rolling from side to side, and sometimes it seemed to Chiller that the engine was rolling clear off of the tracks, but always it regained its feet, and SX 3217 crawled on. Once off of this grade, they were only 5 miles from Walsenburg. If they could make it to that town, the horror of the bad track would be behind them, for they would be on the Camden and Spearfish Lake line east of Warsaw. Chiller knew that the CNSL ran fairly heavy limestone trains out of Summit Pit over the line in the summer, and that there had been some money spent in fixing the line up. There should be few troubles with the tracks there. The last miles up the branch may have been the worst of all, merely because the worst seemed to be over, and that victory over the old, tattered line seemed to be in hand. The run took them through some rolling country with a couple of deep cuts to tunnel through, across another swamp grade, this one no better than the others, and through a long stretch where the snow was about as deep as the plow. It took them an hour to cover the last 3 miles. Chiller was standing on the left side of the cab when a pinkish glow began to be seen through the storm, blinking on and off. He said nothing, but continued to stare at it, wondering what it might be. As SX-3217 crawled toward the pink light, Chiller could suddenly make out what it was. Bar the light at the crossing flashed. Bar. SX-3217 had reached Walsenburg. Even that wasn't the end of the struggle. It had been years since anyone on the train had been up that far, and no one really remembered where the switch to the CNSL main line was. About all that Chiller could do was to ease the plow forward slowly, in hope that somebody would recognize something before they derailed the plow. Fortunately, Anson was able to recognize a line of power poles that he thought paralleled the CNSL tracks. Chiller didn't dare push the plow beyond that. All of the SX-3217 crew that had been up that way at one time or another detrained to look for the switch. As luck would have it, Detour, on the way somewhere else, tripped over the switch flag, buried inches under the snow. From then on, it was easy. While the section man dug at the switch stand, Anson and Pickering eased the plow forward to clear the switch points. With that done, the switch might have been thrown, but the section gang discovered that for whatever reason, the switch had been padlocked. Chiller, by now, wasn't in any mood to let something like a brass padlock stop him. A hacksaw cleared the blockage within a few minutes. It was long after midnight when he had Anson whistle the crew back aboard. Pickering powered the plow up, and the leading Jeep inched it out onto the Camden and Spearfish Lake main line that they had sought for so long. They soon discovered that the CNSL hadn't been running to Walsenburg and Summit Pit in the winter, any more than the DNO had been running past Rochester to Big Pit. The snow here was fully as deep as it had been north of Rochester, and any hopes that Chiller might have entertained about a quick run to Warsaw soon exploded. The run over the final section was about as slow as all of the running they had been doing since nightfall, but with each turn of the plow's blades, they were getting closer to their destination. At least the worries about the bad track were over with. The CNSL line east from Walsenburg wasn't that good, but it was at least on a par with the DNO line north from Coldwater. They were on strange, but familiar territory, now. The last time any of these men had been here, these tracks had been the DNO's. Now, they belonged to a little, foreign railroad, and it was strange to be traveling here. As Snowplow Extra 3217 crept westward, the plow was running just like it was supposed to, and victory seemed in their grasp. After the Kremlin branch, the going was easy. The tracks finally dipped down into a wide, low valley, and again they were running on a grade through a swamp. The snow plume was now being blasted directly downwind, and the snow was hitting the earth and blowing caked snow out of the trees far to the leeward of the plow train. They came to the end of the grade and crossed a long, low trestle over the main branch of the Spearfish River. Once they were on the other side, they faced their last obstacle, the long, deep, narrow trench of Grant's Cut, where Bud Ellsberg and Walt Archer had tried and failed to punch their way through with the Burlington and the Milwaukee the morning before. Now, where even the CNSL's big plow had failed, the rotary could chew right along, blasting a path with the snow that it threw through the tunnel it dug. All of a sudden, SX-3217 lurched to a stop, despite the onward surge of the 3,217's motors. As Anson shut down, Chiller scrambled for the microphone. "Now what the hell?" he yelled. "Engines running fine," Pickering replied from the cab of the plow, buried in the snowbank. "The blade isn't turning, I think. How about backing out of here so we can take a look at it?" Chiller had Anson back the train up a couple lengths to a little area of level ground just before the tracks plunged into the cut. Again, Hoddle and Pickering turned to the plow, while Chiller steamed in the cab of the Jeep. After a few minutes, he could take it no longer, so he climbed down and walked forward to the plow. "You guys got it figured out yet?" he asked. Hoddle looked up from inside the plow's engine cover. In the thin, reflected light from the 3,217's headlight, Chiller could see the frustration in the man's face. "I think we pushed too hard," Hoddle said. "The goddamn main shaft is sheared, right up by the flange that drives the blade. How long is it going to take to fix?" Chiller wanted to know, feeling no less frustration than Hoddle. "There's no way to fix it here," Hoddle said. "Not even if we brought Sawyer and his welding stuff. See, when the shaft went, the snow pushed the blade back into the main bearing and screwed that up. It's going to be a hell of a big job to fix it, a shop job for sure, and we're going to have to come up with a new main bearing." "Is that all?" Chiller asked. "That's about it, except for the fact that it's going to take a crane to lift the blade out so we can change all of that shit. We've only got a couple miles to go." How about if we back up to Walsenburg and try to fix it there? Hoddle shook his head. Maybe, he said finally. Maybe, if we can find the stuff. While Ed was out in the shop, tearing into a couple of injector pumps, Bud left the office and headed over to Rick's. He'd had enough exposure to the National Guard stew in Warsaw. Once was enough to want to have a good meal, and he had steak on his mind. Rick's was empty enough to give the little man time to cook it right. It was the first time in a couple of days that Bud had been off railroad property, but even now, he didn't get that far away. He took a portable radio with him and sat it down on the counter while the odor of steak began to build in the little restaurant. Rick was working in the back of the restaurant, so Bud got his own second cup of coffee. While walking back to the radio, the little radio began to squawk. Spearfish Lake, came Ballard's voice. This is Plow Extra 2. We've got trouble. Bud sat the coffee down and picked up the little radio. I'll take it, Betty, he said, then went on. Plow Extra 2. Do you read Spearfish Lake? What's the problem, Gene? Read you weekly, Ballard replied. Your 303 isn't pulling. The engine is running all right, but it isn't generating anything. Are we clear to return to Spearfish Lake? Where are you? Bud asked loudly. Right about where we almost hit, came the reply. How about trying for Warsaw on just the 9608? Bud asked. If you don't make it there in 3 hours or so, the rock ought to be dry enough by then to come out and take you the rest of the way. There was a moment's silence while Ballard and Lee talked this one over. Finally, Lee responded, Negative, Bud. The 9608 isn't strong enough to haul the train. Push the 303 and plow snow too. We'd have to double most of the way, and Henry and I are getting too beat to do that. Come on back. Then, Bud said, resigned to defeat again. Give us a call if you have trouble. Rick had heard the exchange over the sound of Bud's frying steak. Now, he came out of the kitchen and commented, Not another one. Guess so, Bud replied. Maybe it's something simple, even though we don't have part 1 for the chassis up here. He turned to the radio again. Ed, do you have a radio going in the shop? A few moments of silence went by. Ed had been leaving the radio on in the shop all along, but Bud suspected that he might have turned it off in order to be able to concentrate on the injectors. Bud repeated the call, then after a moment said into the radio, Betty, grab John and have him go out to the shop and give it a call. You're running out of engines, aren't you? Rick commented. I guess maybe, Bud agreed. The only thing I can think of is to lighten up Plow Extra 2 and have the 9608 head on up to Warsaw. Anyway, if it craps out, maybe Walt can come and get it with the Milwaukee, or maybe I can go and get it with the Rock after it dries out a bit. Rick shook his head, then left for a minute to check Bud's steak. When he came back a moment later, he had another question. What about the train the dirty and old is sending up through Kremling? They ought to be able to keep you going. It would, if it ever gets to Warsaw, Bud replied. I'm beginning to think it was a waste of time and money. The last we heard was about 2 this afternoon. They were sitting in Rochester with their plow busted again. They've spent more time sitting than they have running. It'll be a miracle if they get here by this time next week, at that rate. You could use them, couldn't you? You bet I could, Bud said, dreaming. I could do a lot of things with some good power. I could set 2 engines on the Warsaw run. I could leave enough power with the scram train to really be able to scram. The hospital has some stuff they're low on, and I could almost send a train to Camden for that, and for firefighting foam, which they could use on the fertilizer plant up in Warsaw. Believe me, I can find enough for them to do, but without them, I've got to concentrate on what's most important. Ed's voice now came onto the little radio, with a slight edge on it. He didn't like being pulled away from his high-concentration chore. Bud briefly explained the situation with Plow Extra 2, then said, What's the chances of taking the rock back up to Warsaw? Forget it, the mechanic said. It's been on heat long enough now that it'll probably make it to Warsaw without doing any damage, but then you'll want to come back here with an ambulance run or something. You wouldn't make it. It's got to have another 4 hours of heat, at least. It would make it to Warsaw, though? Bud asked. Don't get any bright ideas. I'd be happier with 8 hours of heat, and it'll probably take more than that to get it back in top shape. How about if we slap the rock's fuel pump on the 1478? Won't work, at least not tonight, the radio squawked. Different bolt patterns, at least, different from the Burlingtons. It'd take machine shop work to match them up. Are the pump parts going to match up? Too early to tell, the mechanic responded. The radio was silent for a moment. Betty's voice interrupted the discussion. Bud, she said, the cold water department just arrived. Now there was even more that ought to go to Warsaw, Bud thought. Get him over to the loading ramp and get him loaded, he told Betty. I don't know how long it's going to be before we have power to take them, but they might as well be ready when we do. Now Penny joined in the radio discussion. Bud, we could take the rock, if we make up our minds ahead of time that it's going to have to stay in Warsaw for at least 12 hours. The Milwaukee and the 9608 could do the ambulance runs. Bud let it turn over in his mind for a moment. Sounds reasonable, he said. How about it, Ed? Oh, Hell, you're going to do it, whether I think you should or not. Just be damn sure you put heat on those trucks for 12 hours up there before you have to move it again. All right, Bud replied. I'll be over as soon as I finish eating. John, find Raymond and have him get started with the loading. Then you start yanking those heaters off. At least Fred Linder had gotten some rest, for while he slept, the situation in Warsaw had turned for the worse. He roared past the burning fertilizer plant on his snowmobile, and up Main Street to where the fire had broken yet another line. Warsaw's downtown section was mostly concentrated around the corner of Main and 2nd Streets, with the few stores that the town had running about halfway down the block to 3rd Street from 2nd. There was a house on fire in the middle of the block, and just to the north, Cargill's laundromat was blazing furiously. Masterfield had pulled Albany River around the corner from their position on 2nd Street, and the department was fighting stubbornly against the laundromat fire. The fire in the laundry wasn't bad by itself, but just to the north of it was one of the town's 2 gas stations. With the wind out of the north, there was no great danger of the fire being blown into the gas station, but the place was so volatile that there was no choice but to protect it. Here was another place that Linder and the assembled departments had to save if they were to save the town. Over the past day, the various departments had fought a good many desperate battles, and had lost most of them. This one, they stood a chance of winning. Linder thought hard about supporting Albany River. He could think better, now that he had some sleep. About his only choice was some department out in the backfield. Blair, Lynchburg, and Spearfish Lake were all on the various streets off Herkimer and 3rd, and they'd been having a rough time with spot fires set by embers still being blown from Yard 4 and the various burning buildings. With the oil company right behind them, he didn't dare tap any of them. About the only choice left was Hoselton, up on Herkimer Street next to Blair. The wind was far enough around that he could probably risk it. All of this thought process only took Fred Linder a few seconds. Then, he was off on his snowmobile, over to where the Hoselton department sat waiting. Wally Bork had been expecting the call for some minutes now, and the department was already pretty well picked up. Within minutes, the little department had swung into line next to Albany River. Here, as had happened so many times before, Don Curalt arrived with his bulldozer to make the difference. There was snow all over the place, of course, and Curalt had been clearing out the streets so that the departments would have a place to work. In places on some of the streets, the snow was so deep that the county plows that Bud Ellsberg had brought had difficulty getting through. Only the bulldozer and the front loader that fortunately had been sitting outside Northern Fertilizer could clear out those drifts. Curalt plowed snow several feet deep over the underground fuel tanks, giving them a fireproof insulating layer, and he gently piled snow around the gas pumps, which had been turned off and had their valves closed. Now, the main danger was over at the gas station, for it would be hard for the fire to get to the several thousand gallons of gasoline. But there was still danger left from the various drums of oil, snowmobile gas, and a good many other burnables that could still cause a hot fire. Farther down the street, next to the laundromat, the house fire was going strong. Linder's own Warsaw department was fighting this one, but there obviously wasn't much hope of winning, with the strong wind and the laundry burning next to it. On the south, Warsaw was trying to keep the house fire from spreading to the house south of it, while Meeker was guarding the west side of the houses further to the south. Linder didn't see much hope of keeping the whole side of the block south of the gas station from going. He had seen 3 streets of houses burn out once they got going, over the course of the last day, and there wasn't much hope for saving the 4th. But they might still have some hope of holding the fire to the west side of Main Street. Main Street was wider than Plain Street had been, and the wind was more out of the north than it had been earlier. The day before, when they had been trying to save the houses on Winter Street, the wind had been much more from the east, with the fire sleep blazing Yard 4 right across the street. If the fire got across Main Street, they did have problems. The wind would then be right out of the north, pushing the fire toward the oil company and those thousands of gallons of propane. The firefighters had seen 2 propane explosions in the past few hours, and one of them had injured several firefighters. It didn't take a bright imagination to understand what all those thousands of gallons of propane could do. But, to win this battle, Linder needed another department or 2. And just now there wasn't one left that could be safely stripped from the job it was on to help out along Main Street. Several times now, help had come up the railroad just when it was needed. Hoping against hope, Linder realized that it had been some time since Ellsberg had wanted to know if he could work on engines. Might plow extra 1B right outside of town, bringing the reserves he needed so badly? It was after 1 in the morning when the combined train set out from Spearfish Lake once again. Plow extra 2 was no more. Its plow was pointing westward at the end of the train, and the only part of its power that was left was the ancient 9608, now coupled to the rock, which was once again pushing the big plow eastward. This was the largest train to set out for Warsaw in some time, since Blair and Lynchburg had been hauled in the day before. Behind the big plow, there was the oldish blue and white Jeep, a first-generation product of the diesel era, and the downright ancient Baldwin, a survivor of that era and of more modern steam engines as well. The train was a motley collection of cars, most built for other purposes put pressed into service, as all the rescue runs had been. First, there was the Baldwin's coal gondola, now partly empty. Then, there was the CNSO way car, which had been rudely turned into an ambulance that had saved a good share of lives. After that was the D&O way car, filled with Camden firefighters and a handful of other rescuers, including Sally Keller, who was still intent on succoring Warsaw's homeless, almost all of whom had long been removed to Spearfish Lake. This was followed by two red box cars, one with the mountain goat of the long-vanished Great Northern still on its side, that carried a load of relief supplies, spare hose, and other firefighting gear. Behind this was a flat car, with a Camden school bus on it, loaded with Camden and Coldwater firemen and a state fire marshal that was gratefully asleep. This was followed by 6 more flat cars, the first 2 holding Camden Fire Department snorkel trucks and air compressors. The compressors weren't really needed in Warsaw now, but no one had thought to unload them. The next 4 flat cars carried the most recent arrivals, the apparatus, less one antique pumper, of the Coldwater Volunteer Fire Department. Trailing the whole thing was the little plow, once rescued from a scrap heap, paying for itself many times over in the last day. Up ahead of it all, John Penny stared out of the cupola of the big plow, as he had done on so many trips before. There was nothing new to see, and there were drifts in all of the places he had come to expect drifts, and new ones in places that he didn't expect to see them. The big plow handled either kind easily. "How's it going?" Bud called back to the 9608, which had had the Burlington's radio rudely grafted onto it in the few minutes the engine had been stopped in Spearfish Lake. "Fine," Lee reported. "Best I've seen it since I met this train." In the cab of the blue Jeep, Bud and Jean Ballard sipped at coffee. This was proving to be as uneventful a run as Bud had made since the storm started, as Plow Extra 1 headed through the pine flats north of Spearfish Lake, down the long grade into the Spearfish River swamp, and across the long fill through the swamps where the plowing had been easy on earlier trips. It was easy now, and when the rock's nose pointed slightly upward at the end of the fill, it hardly slowed down the flood of stories about the last few days. "The Hosselton crossing is a few miles past the top of this grade," Bud told his companion. "We'll have to stop there and put on gas masks. We'll be into the toxic smoke not long after. We don't dare duck through the smoke without them, or we'd be making an ambulance run right back down to Spearfish Lake." "They must have been tough to fight a fire in," Ballard commented. "It's not so bad now," Bud replied. "There wasn't much that was on fire in the smoke cloud the last time I was there. Yesterday morning, all of the firefighting had to be done in that kind of stuff. I guess they're gaining that much ground." Fred Linder was losing ground again, but at least this was ground that he expected to lose. Warsaw and Meeker had lost the battle to keep the fire from spreading south from the burning house south of the laundromat. He'd about given up hope for the street on the west side, since he'd had the fire hall call Spearfish Lake. It had turned out that the train had troubles, but they were on their way now, with Coldwater and 2 snorkels from the Camden Fire Department. Linder wasn't too sure where he was going to be able to use the snorkels, but they'd probably prove useful on Main Street. If the fire ever got to the oil company, he'd be downright glad to have them. But they'd only left Spearfish Lake minutes before he'd called, and that had been an hour before. It would take the train at least another hour to get there, and unless they got lucky the whole block would be ablaze by then. The wind was out of the north-northeast by now, and if they could hold the fire that it had gotten going earlier on the west side of Main Street from spreading across the street, and if Blair and Spearfish Lake could deal with the stubborn spot fire on Herkimer Street that they had been fighting with tanker water for a couple of hours now, and if the wind would get around ever farther to the north, and if none of the little spot fires that had been springing up near the oil company got out of hand, and if the overheated pump bearing at the city water plant continued to hold out, as it had held out since the main plant fire started, and if a few other things, then the end might just be in sight. But if any one of those things went wrong, they still could lose most of the town. As always, the key seemed to be in the main fire line, now on Main Street. Linder spent most of his time there, in the hours after midnight, but this didn't keep him and his snowmobile from occasionally appearing at the oil company, where Kremling had held the western perimeter against the fertilizer plant fire for more than a day, or at the spot fires at Herkimer Street, where Blair and Lynchburg and Spearfish Lake were struggling to keep things under control. Although Linder knew that more help was coming, he had begun to be a bit suspicious of more help. It always seemed like things got worse when help got there, spreading the lines even thinner and making the need for more help just as imperative. While Bud waited for gas masks to be distributed from the boxcar, he called ahead to Walt. "What's going on?" He asked. They're back to Main Street, the Milwaukee's engineer answered. We've got another ambulance run waiting. It's going to have to be really serious, Bud told him. We're hurting for power. I'll talk it over with you and Linder when I get there. Here was the problem that he had been dreading, and sooner than he'd hoped. The Rock was clearly out of it for an ambulance run, and the other two engines were only usable together if the danger of using the scram train wasn't too high. But there were only two tired men left that knew how to run the 9608, one of them well into his 70s. An ambulance run now would have to be pretty desperate. Bud thought about walking back to the 9608 to get a feel of how much more he could ask of Stevens and Lee, but a strange voice on the radio interrupted him. Any Camden and Spearfish Lake unit at Warsaw. This is Decatur and Overland Snowplow Extra 3217. To reach him on VHF, they had to be close. With a tear of relief in his eye, Bud carefully keyed the VHF microphone again. Snowplow Extra 3217. This is Bud Ellsberg on Plow Extra 1. Glad you could make it. I've got an ambulance ready to go out, and I haven't got an engine left that can make it to Spearfish Lake by itself. Afraid we can't help you just yet, the voice replied from the D&O train. Our plow is dead again. We're going to back up to Walsenburg and try to fix it, but it may take a while. Disappointment crashed down on Bud. In a defeated voice he asked, Where are you at? Can't tell you the milepost. They're all buried, and our people have forgotten what goes where. We're sitting on the trestle over the Spearfish River east of Warsaw. They were close indeed, just on the other side of Grant's Cut, the worst snowcatcher on the line. How far into the cut did you get? Bud asked over the intervening few miles. Couple 100 yards, maybe a little more. We got into the other side of it maybe 200 or 300 yards yesterday morning, Bud replied, his mind churning. He didn't want to let two geeps slip through his fingers. The going got tough, he went on, and there wasn't any need for us to press on then. That leaves only 200 or 300 yards or so. You guys stay where you are. We'll come and get you. Walt had been monitoring this exchange, and now he called Bud. You know damn when we almost got stuck in that thing yesterday. Right, Bud replied. But I've been talking to the people from Plow Extra too. They had to dig out any number of times with snow shovels. We've got the snow shovels, and there are enough people to dig with them. Let's go for it. It had been Steve Chiller in the cab of the 3217 who had called Bud when he'd heard him talking to Walt. Anson and the two mechanics were with him. Jesus, the road foreman told them. We've seen that cut, and you've seen it, too. They must need us bad. You heard them, Anson said. Apparently, everything they've got is on its last legs. They've got a great, big blade plow, though. They might be able to make it through with that. Bullshit, Pickering said. I was in the middle of it. It's at least 14 feet thick, and it gets worse farther in. I was beginning to wonder if we could chew through it ourselves. Bud, you are crazy as hell, Walt said. Dig through that thing. You looked up that cut yourself. There must be 18, 20 feet of snow back there in spots. Ballard was standing next to Walt. We buried your other plow several times down there by Thunder Lake, and a couple times after that. We dug out and made it up here. We can do it again. I still say, you haven't seen this son of a bitch, Walt said. But, if you're so damn determined, then let's give it a try. That's the spirit, Bud said, turning to look at the flat cars, which were being rapidly unloaded. Fred Linder had already called for the units to go directly to the main fire line at 3rd and Main. After last morning, Bud went on, I don't think we'd better have anybody on the plow. Maybe we can unload your snowmobile off the Rock's running board, and have Gene or John ride it out to spot for us. You want to couple the 9608 into the plow train, too? The engine's owner asked. Not if we can help it, Bill, Bud said. You can haul the bus flats out to the cut separately. We won't use the 9608 unless we don't have power enough to punch through with the diesels. Walt, have someone get in touch with Fred Linder, and have him get every spare hand he can come up with onto the buses, and every shovel they can lay their hands on. Not firemen, but I know there's a shitload of non-firefighters wandering around town. We've got maybe 75 or 100 shovels in the boxcar, Ballard said. Good. We'll use them. It took the railroad men in Warsaw a lot less time to plan the operation than it took to organize it. Most of the trouble came from rounding up 3 or 4 busloads of shovelers at 4 in the morning. They started out with perhaps 50 people already sleeping in the buses, and Bud wanted at least 100 more. While the volunteers were straggling in 2 or 3 at a time, Fred Linder rode his snowmobile over to the idling Rock. What about this ambulance run I just heard about? He asked. It'll have to wait, Bud told him. But it would have had to wait anyway. That's why we need the power that's over on the other side of the cut. Linder shrugged. Well, if you've got to, you've got to. I'd better get back over to Main Street and get those Camden guys working before they try and take over the whole damn show. Not even the most determined poker players were left on SX 3217. As Plow Extra 1 headed west out of Warsaw, most of the train's crew, with every shovel the train carried, were out slowly clawing at the drift from their end. Chiller led a little to the top of the drift, and all of a sudden saw a snowmobile's headlight wallowing toward them. The snowmobile came up to where they were digging in the 3217th headlight, and stopped. "You guys from SX 3217? The snowplow rider asked. "Sure are. Steve, Chiller's the name. John Penny, from the CNSL, and Conrail before that. What are you doing out here?" "Spotting," Penny replied. "I've ridden that plow since the beginning of this, but we decided that it was not a real bright idea here. They're very far away. Just leaving now. I rode out ahead to see what we were going to be up against. I'd better get back. You want to ride along?" "Sure," Chiller replied, getting on the back of the snowmobile. Penny twisted the throttle, and the little machine began to hum as he headed back up the cut. "How are things going with the fire?" Chiller shouted over Penny's shoulder. "Haven't heard much for a while, but I guess there's a chance they may be able to save the rest of the town." "You've been busy?" "Damn straight," Penny replied. "Of the 11 fire departments over there, we hold in 8 of them. We kind of given up on you people." "We kind of given up ourselves," Chiller reflected. "For that matter, we haven't made it yet. I heard Ellsberg talking about the 9608 on the radio. Is Bill Lee with it?" "Sure is. We'd better not tell him right now," Chiller said, but his daughter was hurt when their Alco derailed. She was bringing us parts for our plow. Last we heard, one of our brakemen had walked out through the storm to get help. "We won't have a chance now, anyway," Penny replied. "Here they come." The tracks east of Warsaw had drifted up fairly badly since the Burlington and the Milwaukee had been over them the morning before, but not so badly that the 2 diesels couldn't plow up to the edge of Grant's Cut in one pass. The plan had been to clear the way for the 9608 to bring up the trainload of shovelers, but since the old 260 was lagging behind, Bud couldn't resist backing off and making a short run at the unbroken snow. Neither of the 2 diesels were pulling very hard by now, and Bud didn't think that they had enough power to get deep enough to get stuck. The rock in the Milwaukee hit the drifts with about the speed that had been used the night before, and they knifed perhaps 30 yards past the point where Bud had called it off. Once the snow finally brought the train to a stop, Penny called over the portable. "Good run," he said, "but it's deep. I can just barely see the top of the plow." "All right, Walt," Bud ordered. "Back down." The 2 engines growled, but in both of the cab's slip indicators wailed. "Let's take slack forward and try again," Walt suggested. The 2 engines moved forward the few inches that they could muster, then back down again. Smoke rolled from both exhaust stacks, and even from the rock Bud could hear the Milwaukee's diesel wind up and shriek louder than it ever had before. The train didn't move. "Idle down," Bud ordered. "All right," Bud ordered the 9608. "Bring them up." While the small army of snow shovelers was digging away at the buried snow and starting to carve a trench up the cut, Lee looked at the old NW2, entirely unaware of the bad news that awaited him a few yards away. His verdict was quick. For the 3rd time in a day, he pronounced last rites over an engine. "Bus bar's burnt out. Must have leaned on it too hard. It's not getting power to either truck. Probably not hard to fix, but there'd be no way to fix it here." Bud agreed. "She's dead weight now. Let's not shut her down and drain her here, though. We can wait until we get it back to Warsaw. If everybody's off the consist, you might as well back it up a ways. I guess we'll want you to couple up for the next run." Lee backed the old Baldwin up the tracks, and Bud radioed to his brakeman. "How are they coming on the plow?" From the back of Walt's snowmobile, Penny replied, "I think you're loose already." "Right," Bud said. "We'll try to pull out as soon as the 9608 gets back." A few minutes later, the attention of the snow shovelers was diverted as the diesel and the old steamer belched noise and smoke as the plow slowly backed out of the cut. "That'll do it for now," Bud radioed. "We'll sit here until some digging gets done." Slowly, a narrow notch appeared in the middle of the deep snow of the cut, for there were nearly 200 people out there, shoveling at about as many yards of deep snow. Some of the people were Warsaw people. Many of these were men who had worked at Jerusalem paper. They were without jobs now, and that would be a problem, but for a moment, that didn't matter. Some of the people with snow shovels were people who had come to Warsaw to help. Most of the able-bodied men from Hoselton were there, and so was a large part of the National Guard artillery battery from Spearfish Lake. The most recent arrivals were there, too, the crew of SX 3217. In the blinding snow, it seemed to each shoveler a rather hopeless task, but their combined effort was moving a lot of snow. In time, Bud Ellsberg and Gene Ballard walked up the first part of the cut to inspect the progress. "What do you think?" Bud asked. "Worth a try," the D&O man replied. "It beats sitting around doing nothing. Let's just take it real easy. We'll have a lot of momentum, but not much power." A few minutes later, Bud ordered the plow train back. Once he had a little room, he gently shoved the big plow forward. It bit into the snow where it had been stuck, and the train sagged to a stop. "You gained a little," was Penny's verdict. "Try it again." Bud tried again. The combined power of the old diesel and the ancient steamer took another bite at the cut and gained perhaps another 10 yards. Each few yards that they gained meant that much less that had to be shoveled out, and they slowly began to compress the line of snow shovelers into a solid mass. Soon, they were getting more dug out in front of them, and they could gain more ground with each pass. Steve Chiller and John Penny paralleled each pass of the plow as it worked. There was a long way to go at 10, then 12, then 15 yards at a run, and each run took some time to set up. An hour dragged by, then more, but each run went a little farther than the one before. Bud would back the train up on the rock's power alone, then whistle the train forward with its metallic air horn. His order would be replied to with the deep-throated, romantic steam whistle of the old Baldwin, as its power joined internal combustion and electricity to shove the plow forward once again. At last there came a run where the diesel bellowed and the old Baldwin panted as the plow knifed through the cut. They had barely enough speed and barely enough power, and they nearly stalled again before they broke out onto ground that had been cleared by SX 3217's rotary a few hours before. Behind the rock, Bill Lee and Henry Stevens felt the going eased, and they cut the power to the 9608. In the rock, Bud didn't take off all the power. Finally feeling triumphant, he let plow extra 1 drift forward. Penny called off the distance, and Bud let the train creep forward until he stopped it with the point of the big plow barely touching the lip of the D&O rotary. In the hours before dawn of that snow-filled morning, 2 trains arrived in Warsaw from the east. The first was led by 6 flat cars, carrying school buses loaded with people. It was pushed by an old Baldwin 260 running backwards, followed by an idling orange and black EMC&W, 2 half its age, and by a blue and white EMD GP, 7 that had been encased in snow and ice in its runs up and down the line for 2 days. The train was trailed by an ugly black snowplow the size of a small house, the ice and snow on it not covering the burned chars that it bore. A few hundred yards back, the second train followed, pushing an even uglier snowplow, its 2 matched red and white GP9s at either end, with 2 cabooses and 4 old boxcars sandwiched in between. The long line of flat cars blocked the crossing at Plant Street. The buses on them began to empty as the snow shovelers detrained and headed for the kettles of hot coffee and hot soup that awaited them. Bud got down from the Jeep and walked forward to the plow. As he inspected it the best he could in the dark, another figure came up to greet him. "Are you Bud Ellsberg?" the figure asked. "I am. I'm Steve Chiller. I'm in charge of SX 3217. "Glad to meet you, Steve," Bud said sincerely. "Hell of a way to have to get here, but we made it. Thanks. Now that we're here, what do you want us to do?" It was time for Bud to let his feelings of victory go for a bit and get back to business. There was an ambulance run that still needed to be made, and the order of cars in Warsaw was now thoroughly confused. The 2 of them walked back to the cab of the Rock, where presently John Penny and Tom Bigelow arrived to join them. It took a few minutes to work out all the details. The Rock and the 9608 would stand by in Warsaw to protect the Scram train, and Walt Archer could look after the Rock. 1 SX 3217-way car and the D&O-way car from Plow Extra 2 would stay with it. Bud decided that he would ride along on SX 3217 as it returned to Spearfish Lake on the ambulance run. It would take the little Plow CNSL ambulance-way car and one of its own, along with the Milwaukee, being towed dead, several empty flat cars, and some of the other odd cars that had accumulated in Warsaw. The rotary would be shoved onto a siding and forgotten by now. Switching everything around took a little while, but Bud was perfectly ready to sip coffee in the dining car with Steve Chiller while Penny supervised all of the shuffling. Eventually, Frank Matson caught Bud's attention and motioned him outside. "I'm going back to Spearfish Lake and study those survival figures that Benny prepared," Bud told him. "What was it that you wanted to talk to me about a little while ago?" "This is important, and it's confidential," Matson replied. "It's even more confidential with all of these D&O people around. I got to talking with C.J. Green, the chief of the Kremlin Fire Department, right after you left the last time. So it seems that Green is also the superintendent for Big Pit. You know, the aggregate quarry down there." "Yeah," Bud replied, getting more interested. "So it seems that the D&O just jacked their freight rates sky high a couple weeks ago, and they're already paying a hell of a lot more than we're charging on the traffic from Summit Pit. We've got nothing on paper yet, but we've tentatively agreed to match Summit Pit rates on haulage from Big Pit." "Glad you haven't got anything on paper," Bud replied. "I was talking to Steve Chiller there for a while. The Kremlin branch is totally unusable. It was only good luck and frozen ground that got them over it at all. That's the beautiful part," Matson replied. "Big Pit owns the line down to the switch for the Kremlin branch, and Green thinks that they jacked the rates up on him because they want to abandon the line north of Rochester. We've heard that from the DNO down in Decatur before, Bud snorted. Abandon a customer with a lot of car loadings to cut costs. But we still don't have any money to fix up the branch. Oh, but we will, Matson said. They've agreed to a surcharge on our rates that matches the DNO's new rates for 3 years, so we can fix up the line. They want to talk a very long-term contract. Sounds reasonable, Bud said. Marks will shit when he finds out, but if they're trying to get rid of a customer, it serves them right. We've done all right on lines they thought were worthless, and we can do it some more. I just want it understood that this whole thing isn't just a ploy to bludgeon the DNO. That's the beauty of it, Matson said. We're talking, short-term, the same rates. Green has watched us support this town with everything we have, and that makes him think that he'll get better service in the long run with us. I will be damned, Bud said. I thought we were going to be selling the Burlington, at least. Guess we can't do that now. All of that business is going to be in the summer, and we're going to busier than hell. The winter is going to be dead, though. Maybe not. Matson lowered his voice even more. I don't know much about this yet. You know that Jerusalem paper was going to shut the plant down, anyway, mainly because it was old and worn out. Now that they don't have it, they have insurance money, a trained workforce, and support from a local bank, meaning me. They've also been offered an even better break on freight rates for increased traffic. Marshall thinks that there's a chance, a long shot, but a chance, that they might build a modern, high-capacity plant here. Double damned, Bud said. I'll kick those thoughts around quietly while I'm going over Betty's stuff. Try to make it back here this afternoon, Matson replied. Marshall has a teleconference set up for this morning. We might know more later. Will do, Bud said, if the trains run right. Bud could see from the state of the switching that SX 3217 was getting about ready to leave. He'd promised to ride in the cab of the 3217 to show Chiller and Barton Slanger and Anson the route to Spearfish Lake and explain its limitations. As he walked toward the waiting GP9, he found a couple of men struggling to unload a snowmobile from one of the bus flat cars. The two men proved to be Chiller and Bill Lee. What's going on? Bud asked. His daughter got hurt helping us get up here, the DNO man replied. She was a big help, too. Now, he's going to ride down the Kremlin branch to Coldwater, where she's in the hospital. That's dumb, Bud said. Leave that thing on there until we get to Spearfish Lake. Then you can ride right down the state road to Coldwater. It's a hell of a lot shorter, and if you run into trouble, there are houses along the way. All right, Lee said, but we've still got to get it off of here. This car is staying here. The three of them struggled with the heavy snowmobile. Lee had ridden it from Lawrencetown to Meeker to catch up with his old Baldwin. If he hadn't made that ride, there was a good chance that neither Plow Extra 2 or SX 3217 would have gotten through it all. In a few minutes, they had the snowmobile loaded on a flat car headed for Spearfish Lake. Bill, I know you're worried, Chiller said. If you want to take your mind off of things, there'll be a poker game going on in the way car. Lee smiled. I haven't been in a good poker game in a long time. As Lee climbed up into the DNO way car, Chiller told Bud, that poker game has been going on since we started. It had something like $84 in it when it started, and that $84 has been in most of the pockets on this train. That's the first new money that it'll have seen. You got some serious poker players there, Bud replied, knowing that he'd be straining to keep a poker face of his own for the next few hours. The two of them walked toward the cab of the 3217, which was idling softly in the pre-dawn darkness with snow blowing all around it. They passed the Milwaukee, sitting dead and cold. We're taking our mechanics, too, Chiller told Bud. Maybe they can help get something from your deadline in Spearfish Lake working. The two of them climbed into the waiting GP9. Jim Barton Slanger was standing there. Bud, Steve said, I'd like you to meet one of the finest young throttle hands I've seen in a long time. Pleased to meet you, the engineer said. Steve, are we about ready to go? Guess so, Chiller said. Check with Bigelow and Penny. They'll know. Moments later, SX 3217 was heading down the tracks towards Spearfish Lake. The snow blowing across the tracks in a dead crosswind was lighted in a soft, pre-dawn light. Bud and Steve fell to talking about the past couple of days, and were totally engrossed in storytelling when Barton Slanger looked back over his shoulder and piped up. Jesus, would you look at that? That may be the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Steve Chiller and Bud Ellsberg stood up, and each of them looked out of a different cab window of the 3217. Back behind the train, red and layered and swollen, but looking like it meant it, the sun was coming up. The storm was over. The pine trees off to the south of the tracks shimmered in the heat waves of the August afternoon. There was an impressive amount of skin and sweat in the crowd surrounding the unique but appropriate speakers platform for most of the population of Warsaw, and a lot of firefighters and other interested people from other towns had come to this ceremony. Brent Marshall was speaking. It's no secret now that the fire was a blessing of sorts to the people of Warsaw for the destruction of the old plant, which had outlived its usefulness. cleared the way for Jerusalem Paper Products to construct this new, high-capacity plant here, which we have come to dedicate today. A good many people were responsible for its construction, and it's almost impossible to name them all. But Marshall wasn't a very good public speaker, and Bud's mind wandered back to those days a year and a half before when the paper plant had been a lost cause. The arrival of the Camden snorkel trucks and a department from Coldwater had been the reserves that Fred Linder had needed. In a desperate battle that lasted most of the morning of the 10th, Linder's forces had managed to hold the fire to the east side of the block on Main Street. By nightfall, both the main fire and the spot fires to the west were thoroughly out. Still, it had taken 3 more days before all of the fire in Warsaw followed. The final drowning of the pulp yards had been a slow process, and the quenching of the fertilizer plant had taken longer still. The fertilizer plant fire wasn't brought under control until Bud and Steve Chiller made up a lash-up of the rock and the 2 DNO GP9s. Sloat hadn't been able to repair the injector pumps, but Hoddle managed to get the chassis running. While it stood by Warsaw with the 9608 to power the Scram train if it was needed, the 3 Geeps battered their way past Thunder Lake with the big plow, and returned from Camden with 2 boxcars of chemicals for firefighting foam and 2 injector pumps. It turned out that only 1 boxcar load was needed before the toxic gas danger was over, and the CNSL could again use the school bus flats to return the people of Warsaw to their homes. As Bud had expected from the first, it had taken the DNO months to get the drawbridge at Camden fixed. Indeed, it wasn't fixed yet. After SX 3217 finally returned down the Kremlin branch, towing the 1478 and the crippled Milwaukee, which needed truck work at Putnam Yard, the chassis became the most important engine that the CNSL owned. The little GE was light enough to make the run over the tattered Kremlin branch with a couple of cars in some degree of safety. As they hauled off partially burnt fertilizer to a sanitary landfill, hauled in new fertilizer to replace it in the plant that Chip Halsey hurriedly built outside of town, hauled traffic for transfers to the DNO's network of branch lines on the north side of Camden, and more carloads for customers along the Camden and Spearfish Lake line. The little GE was kept going day and night, crawling up and down the decrepit line. Once the decision had been made to rebuild the paper plant, Jerusalem Paper had become concerned for its experienced workforce in Warsaw and the necessity to keep them at hand for the new plant. The company did what it could to meet the demands that the Warsaw plant would have met by starting a 3rd shift at its Rochester plant and staffing it with Warsaw people. It had taken mine detectors to find the buried Ellen Alco in its snowdrift and a crew of men to dig it out, but Lee had it back in service to greet his daughter as she arrived back from the hospital, her arm and leg in a cast, her back still sore, but not broken. Bud and Bill Lee had long been friends, but now the relationship was even closer. Bud's relationship with the DNO had deteriorated over the Big Pit business, and service to Kremlin had been terrible. Working together, Lee had been able to arrange for trackage rights between Kremlin and Whiteport. With the washout north of Haleyville repaired, Bud had a second connection to the outside world. The 3rd shift at Rochester couldn't accommodate all of the Jerusalem Paper employees, and times in Warsaw had been hard for a while. With help from the Big Pit people, the state, and the Spearfish Lake State Savings Bank, Bud was able to hire a good many of the unemployed men in Warsaw and put them to work under Raymond Tefk and Fred Linder on fixing up the Kremlin branch. By the time that spring came, the branch was usable if they kept the speed slow, and it had improved considerably since. That first summer was busy indeed. Bud put the 2 Geeps into 24-hour service, running unit trains of rock from Summit Pit and gravel from Big Pit down to the loading docks in Camden, which fortunately were north of the drawbridge. All the extra switching in Camden brought another problem. Randall McPhee recovered from his trip on Plow Extra 2, but both he and Henry Stevens had to admit that they were getting busier than they wanted to be. It seemed something of a risk at first, but Bud had assigned John Penny and the repaired Milwaukee to Camden, figuring that John could learn a lot from McPhee and Stevens as the old man worked turning about. The arrangement lasted through the summer, and then both of the Oldtimers decided that the time had come to hang it up for good. All summer long, Bud had been stretched thin for power. Once they scrabbled their way through the summer, Bud went engine shopping again. The CNSL now boasted 2 more engines, both multiple unit equipped GP7s. But somehow, neither of the new engines had acquired nicknames yet. They doubtlessly would in time. Councilman Jim Horton was speaking now. This town wouldn't have been left standing, and a lot of people wouldn't have been here today if it hadn't been for the railroads. Not just the Camden and Spearfish Lake, but the Decatur and Overland and the Lordstown Northern as well. Every time we looked up, it seemed, there was a train arriving with more help from outside. There was a train that evacuated our people to safety, and in our darkest hours, when everything was lost, there was a train waiting to haul the rest of us out of danger. We've overlooked the railroad a lot, but it was there when we needed it, no matter whose railroad it was. One of the people we have to thank the most for that is Milford Ellsberg. Bud, it's your turn to speak. Bud got up and climbed slowly to the microphone while the tiny Warsaw High School band struggled with a tune. As the strains of the Rock Island Line filled the air, Bud looked out into the crowd to see a lot of friends and familiar faces, such as Fred Linder, whose temporary job with the CNSL had kept the hero in town, and Rod Turpin, whose life had been saved by a fast run to Spearfish Lake, and Joe McGinnis, who had taken over a lot of Bud's accounting business that was needed with the huge temporary workforce on the Crewman branch. And, for that matter, two more people that wouldn't have been there except for the railroad, Darla and Brent Page, who had interrupted their honeymoon to drive the 9608 to Warsaw this day. As the Rock Island Line died away, Bud began to speak. Jim was right, he said. There are a lot of people here today that wouldn't be here except for the railroad. There's been a lot of talk today about the heroism of the railroad people, not just us from the Camden and Spearfish Lake, but from the Lordstown Northern and the Decatur and Overland as well. I don't like to think of it as heroism. We were just doing our jobs, and we tried to do the best we could with what we had. Bud looked out over the crowd from the unique, but appropriate speaker's platform. The front platform of a blue and white GP7 shined as it had never shone before, on whose side the lettering had been proudly restored for all to see. The Rock. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.